and over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and taking a little bit of your free time on a Saturday to learn about my personal journey. So welcome to Passing JavaScript Developer I and what I learned along the way. My name is Christian Sander Knapp. I work as head of Salesforce development at Apparel, which is a Munich-based ISV. So I live and work in Germany. I'm Salesforce MVP and I co-lead the Munich developer group. You can see my Twitter handle. I usually talk only about the Salesforce there. You can see my GitHub, where you can find all the stuff that I'll be showcasing to you today. And if anyone's interested, also my Trailblazer ID. I think I should say I'm really enthralled with Trailhead, so spending a bit of time there. Okay, today's topic is the JavaScript developer examination, and here's what we're going to talk about today. I will briefly showcase the outline of the exam. I will talk about how it's weighted and what guidelines you can find online. All of the things I will be showing you there is on trailhead.com, so I'm just giving you a brief summary and a few perspectives. Then we will switch over to my personal Salesforce journey. I'm basically a platform native. So in order to get JavaScript certified, I had to learn JavaScript from scratch. And I'll give you a little bit of insight how the platform and JavaScript was for me before I started and after I started. There are a few things in the exams that I will talk about that caught me by surprise. By surprise, I mean they were stressful, and maybe right from the start, this session will not be pretty much about exams contents, but rather about exam concepts and mostly about code. So the half of the session will be about what apps did I build to prepare for the JavaScript certification. And as you might already know, the JavaScript certification is a two-part certification. So there's the exam, multiple choice exam, and the Lightning Web Component Super Badge that you need to complete to get certified. Okay, and with that, without further ado, let's go and have a look on the exam itself. The slides will be shared. You will find all the links there in at the end of the session. We will share the slides, and we will focus in the first part on the exam. And what I really want to point out is what it says right at the beginning, that the suggested experience level is 1 to 2 years of experience as JavaScript developer, which means as JavaScript developer, not a JavaScript developer necessarily on the platform, but somebody who has done web development or a server-side development with JavaScript over the course of 1 to 2 years. Now, did I do that actively in my job? No, I did not. Did I still pass the exam? Yes, it's totally possible. But the joy for me was in learning all the new things that I'm going to talk about to you today. Technically, this is a 65-question multiple choice exam. You have 105 minutes, which means you got 1.6 minutes roughly per question. And there is also a passing score, of course, with all Salesforce certifications, that's 65%. If you have a look on the topics that are covered in the exam, you will find a percentage guideline, what you should know about, and I translated that for you in the amount of questions. So you will have around about 15 questions of variable and types and 16 questions of objects, functions, and classes. How that relates to each other, we'll have a look at that in a second. So the basic idea is if you get 65% of all of them correct, you will pass the exam, and after you pass the exam and you complete the super badge and all the requirements, you will then be JavaScript certified. All right, with that, I will have a quick glance into the chat window. Or Ahmed, are there any pressing questions right now?
No, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay, is my speed all right? Yeah,
Yep, all
okay.
look good. I will be interrupted if there is any issue.
Thank you so much. Awesome. So these are the questions and how they allocate to topics. And then I did a little mind map for you. And there's also on the right-hand side, which is also copied from Trailhead, you will see which topics in particular are covered by the exam. And you will also see how the things cluster. So most of the stuff, no surprise, because the percentage already told us, is in the first two categories. So JavaScript fundamentals. The rest is around debugging, error handling. Asynchronous programming is a larger spot. We will cover that in the code part. And don't fret if you don't understand all the words I'm saying here, because I will give you the resources to look them up if you aren't familiar with JavaScript at all. And my assumption today is we just know there's JavaScript, and we may have used it in the past in Visualforce maybe, or even Aura. But for all things standing, we assume JavaScript is just something new that we need to wrap our heads around. That being said, the exam is really only about JavaScript. There are no platform-specific questions. Let me repeat that. There are no Salesforce-specific questions in the multiple choice exam. I'm saying that from the background of somebody who took the beta exam, which was twice as many questions in double as much time. I had the honor of doing the full-blown set of questions, and none of them were dealing basically with Salesforce. In contrast, there are a few things beyond JavaScript in the terms of if somebody today builds something in JavaScript, they will have knowledge about Node APIs. They will have knowledge about NPM, and they will probably have used one or the other greater NPM library. Again, if that doesn't ring a bell, we'll cover that in a little bit. So, as I said, for all terms and purposes, JavaScript is something new, and I was telling you that this session is also about my very personal journey to JavaScript and becoming JavaScript certified, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about how was my life before LWC, Lightning Web Components, before even Salesforce DX. And where were my touch points with JavaScript on the platform, Salesforce, that meaning basically a sales and service cloud. And two things immediately came to mind: Visualforce and action functions, and obviously Aura, that started way back in 2014 or 2015 and was the predecessor of today's Lightning Web Components. So I will show you a little bit of code. And the most important thing is that you don't need to read everything. I will point out the important things. The first touch point with me after a long time with JavaScript were action functions and everything concerning Visualforce. What's the action function? It's up here. It calls an Apex action, and the actual JavaScript magic is happening on here on on-click handler and the return false. And we will zoom in this bit in a second, where the actual JavaScript lives. And don't fret, it's not a lot of code. It's the usual Visualforce type of JavaScript. We're trying to identify some element on our Visualforce page by some weird ID that we just identified by inspecting the page. We make heavy use of alerts if something goes wrong. And in the end of the day, we call our save account action, which is actually our call to Apex, and that's as much JavaScript as there's used in an action function in a good case. And as you see, there's not a lot of happening. And it's all down there in the later part of the body, so it loads last, which I remember it used to be best practice concerning scripts in Visualforce pages. Now, how about Aura? This is a typical Aura action, and again, you might wonder, or might actually recognize that if you take those brackets away here at the very end and you just take the curly brackets, then you're in some sort of JSON notation where you have a property and the property is of type function and you're in the midst of JavaScript. But what you actually do is you make a function or a controller action, as it's called in Aura, and you seem to get some value from a component, and then you call some $A magic util library and do some logic on it, and afterwards you set the thing to a new value, and that's JavaScript. Up until very recently. And if you look at current implementation and showcases of, for example, the Lightning Web Components recipes, then you will find that things changed. And also if you have, you don't even need to go that far, because if you used to work with DX and do a project create, then you will also see, if you look close enough, that you have left the boundaries of a Salesforce project and are actually within a JavaScript project. So how does JavaScript look like nowadays without Aura and without Visualforce? And well, differently. And I will just point out a few things that I felt uncomfortable with and I didn't know about until recently. So where does arguments come from, for example? So my first index here. What's the prototype thingy here? What's this weird left side assignment? I'm used to see arrays on the right-hand side instead. What's this fat arrow? This is very alien and doesn't really look like much what we saw here, and certainly not what we saw here. So things have obviously changed, and I had a lot of question marks. Same goes for Salesforce DX. Okay, let's assume we do a force project create, which is the command to create a vanilla empty Salesforce DX project. And you have one JSON file there, and that is what it says. It's 11 files long, and it just defines some path directories and a Salesforce login URL and the API version of our project. But if you look in the same project a little bit filer, so not on the sfdx-project.json, but into your package.json, you see this. And I got confused again because, all right, what kinds of scripts are we talking about? Why is this a package.json? I thought this was my package definition because it also says package directories. But in fact, there's lots more happening. There are scripts, there are development dependencies, there's something called Husky. And again, what exactly am I supposed to do with it? It's just there in my MTDX project, right? I didn't ask it to be there. It's just by default there. And that made me realize nothing in JavaScript. And well, in terms of Game of Thrones, there's a character that framed one sentence: the mind needs books like the sword needs a whetstone. That was Tyrion Lannister. And what I did first back in 2014 even, so not exactly yesterday, was I sat down and read a book about JavaScript in order to wrap my hand around all the language concepts. And that book, or book series, actually was You Don't Know JS by Kyle Simpson in the first edition, which was written around 2014 or 15. There are 6 short books, I have to say, which gave me a complete rundown of JavaScript fundamentals, how the language developed, what the new ES6 features are, and how specific language paradigms, let's put it that way, language paradigms work, like closures, or what's variable hoisting, for example. And if you read those books, you will be set up to deal with all the fundamentals. And if you want to go into the newest terms of JavaScript, then there's also another excellent resource, which is es6-features.org, which also gives you the quick rundown of what happened in the very recent version of JavaScript. For those who haven't heard ECMAScript yet, that's one of the terms that JavaScript goes around by. We are currently working with ECMAScript 6, and we'll be going towards 7 soonish, but that's their whole consortium making the decisions on the language, excuse me. And what we are talking today is basically ES6, and ES6 is also the standard for the JavaScript certification. All right. So I ingested the book, I ingested the language fundamentals, I wrapped my hand and prototypes change and all other JavaScript niceties, and found out I read 6 books and not a word in 6 books about these things here. And no surprise, after reading a few books, I still feel like what's happening here. And that is because the books do not cover the game of Node. By Node, I mean Node.js, which makes your JavaScript files run in the back end, so to say. JavaScript used to be a front end or browser-based technology. Now it can also run as a back-end server technology, and that is also responsible for the uptake of JavaScript as a language for many, many enterprise projects. And only if you wrap your hand as well around the new JavaScript, the old and new JavaScript concept, as well as Node.js, then you will have the knowledge to get through the exam in terms of concepts. And please be aware, once again, it's 1.6 minutes per question. That's not awfully a lot of time. So if you're not also experienced in applying those concepts, you might get stressed out. And I felt like after reading so much about the stuff and also reading about Node, I needed to actually feel what I had to learn. And in order to feel what I need to learn, in order to better grasp it, I started building stuff. And that's what the second part about this talk today will soon be. Before we start with actually looking at the code, let me give you 2 or 3 examples that made me stress out during the exam. There's an awesome talk called WAT. In the link down there, we unfortunately don't have the time to watch it, or maybe at the end of the session, slides, you will find it here hilarious too. So during the exam, I was surprised by being a compiler most of the time. So assume you have a new date, for example, and somehow you want to get the current hours of the date, and you need to give what kind of, what type of code, 4 types of answers, and one of them, and you need to find out what you need to pass in there. There's also the issue with the new keyword as a new concept or construct or syntactic sugar, depending on how you see it. To be prepared to also solve issues like, for example, in line 13 and 14, where there's 3 little dots and a push command or a function call, and then we push the other array, and you need to map in your brain how. Up in the beginning of the slides, you had types, primitives, objects, and a little bit of implicit versus explicit conversion. And that also stressed me out during the exam. Those are the mean sides of JavaScript, probably, which is not a strongly typed language and has an opinionated way of doing things in certain regards. Mostly you can follow rules, and if you apply the rules by heart, then you can follow along. But once again, you don't have a lot of time. And the mean thing about that, from a personal perspective, is okay, I should know about implicit and explicit type conversion, but never ever would I at least consciously write such a line of code. Why would I ever take an object and add an array to it? But nonetheless, the compiler understands this and puts not a number there. And NaN is also a JavaScript context variable, which means it's a return type for very, very specific cases where the compiler says, no, this is not a number, hence NaN. Right, with that, we have covered everything concerning the axiom and the contents of the axiom. As I said, wrapping up, it's only about JavaScript and current JavaScript language context. It's not about Salesforce, not a single question, and you need to prepare to read and understand and indicate your understanding of JavaScript code. And Node, as we saw, and Node is something that I got curious about. And for the last part, yeah, being a compiler in Axiom, I'm not really sure if I like that so much, but what other options do you have? I'm not a big fan of multiple choice axioms per se, but being the compiler, no, wasn't fun for 3 hours. Okay, with that, we have reached midway of our content. We will now switch over to the code part, which might be an awesome time to look for questions. Amit, please.
Okay, so there was so far one question. Does exam have a specific version of ECMAScript?
It's targeted toward ECMAScript 6, yes. ECMAScript 6. Okay. After a lot of theory, we will dive into the itsy bitsy juices of things that I built. I will always showcase a little bit of the app. The apps were always built in the context of community in mind, meaning I wanted something to work for the developer or the administrator community here in Munich. And that's how the ideas grew. And the first thing I built was the so-called Visit Ohana survey, which I will open up quickly for you. And hope everything is working out. In the meantime, I skipped a little bit of information over here. Everything I'm talking today is hosted on Heroku, and I will not be talking about Heroku today. And also I'm using Node 13. Why is this important? Because if you, as soon as you start, I learned, start building with Node, only with Node 12 or Node 13 is ECMAScript 6 natively supported. Before that, you had to go extra steps and through extra hoops to get ECMAScript 6 working for Node, which all JavaScript wizards knew about. I didn't, so I'm really, really happy that I don't need to care about this anymore. So I built a Visit Ohana survey for with Node 13, and it's a very, very simple idea. It's a web page where you can indicate topics of interest for your community group and indicate who you are, and you fill in a little capture and you hit save. And that's it. Each submission is valued. Thank you, job done. We're going back to the slides in order to go into detail. So my goals were, and I always need goals. So I'm not building to learn something, I build something to achieve something and learn along the way. So my goals were, I wanted to get familiar with building Lightning Web Components, and that outside of the platform. So I really had to use JavaScript and my JavaScript knowledge. I also did not use any base components and built everything from scratch. I wanted to learn how LWC OSS open source works, which means LWC is something that you can use standalone to build your own apps. And I wanted to understand building the survey app, How do I talk to the backend in such a case? Because LWC lives in my browser and still needs some information from the backend, like in the Salesforce server. And how exactly is LWC tied to the backend? And the answer here is Express.js. I also wanted to learn how to implement NPM library and lift the mysteries of the package.json that lives in my DX folder, for example. I wanted to get SLDS to run, and I wanted to talk safely to Salesforce. And as I mentioned, the overall idea was to get communities engaged, community members engaged, and give them a possibility, even at midnight, if they wake up and have a great idea for a talk or a topic, to just submit it. How much effort was it? Well, after deciding on a few basic things like that, I wanted static SLDS and how to hook it up in the whole process. I also found Express.js as a good solution, and I wanted to talk with Salesforce, with JSForce, which is a library, a JavaScript library that is blazingly fast and proxies all Salesforce APIs that you can think of. And actually, it's very, very easy to build the app that you saw, at least the fundamentals, because our amazing René Winkelmeyer, who's principal architect evangelist by now, has built LWC -create -app, which helps you in a few simple questions to get all the wiring done, and you can start coding immediately. And that's what I did, because it's not really spectacular. I just created a few components, LWC components, a modal. I used JSForce to get the metadata information from Salesforce, and then I built the modal that you see in similar ways, like it is shown in Trade, for example. The real work I felt was done by René's package. So I didn't know anything about Express.js or how I could actually wire up LWC OSS. Everything was neatly wrapped up. I could get started immediately, which meant a tremendous head start into building components and simple JavaScript for a start before diving into the other projects. And the next project is this one here. Links are always down there. It's another Heroku app which does the following. It gets a few URLs and then gets quotation from the release notes and displays them in your browser. So the idea is, imagine back then an in-person meeting, and you have the screens running, it's break time, and you want some kind of screensaver, you can put this app up, and you will have little tidbits of release notes information. As I said, I was quick in building my first JavaScript web server app in years with René's tooling, but I wanted also to find out what's the deal with Node and NPM in particular. So the app that I built here basically consists of two parts. One part is a simple NPM package, which does the actual release node parsing and grabs the URLs and grabs the content and returns data. And the other is the UI, which is different than the first one because I wanted to get a roundabout feeling on what JavaScript and tooling had to offer. So my learning goals in the first part of the two-part app was build and publish an NPM package from scratch, understand how dependencies work and how package.json in Node works for NPM as such, then explore async, think back to the exam. There's at least 8% or 13% on async JavaScript. And also, which I think is absolutely necessary if you really want to work professionally with something, is, okay, I'm doing a code project. How do I run it? How do I debug it? how do I find a fault? How do I test it even? Whereas I did not invest a lot of time on testing and jest, for example, although it is also part of the exam. I did at least all the trails that are available. The idea behind an npm package is simply there's a choice of URLs, fetch and parse them from the release notes, and provide a structured list immediately. And if we want to have a look at it, that's the whole package. Please be aware we are in VS Code right-hand side, and as you see, there's not much here. We have the package.json, which defines the contents and dependencies of my functionality, which I want to package, and that's the whole logic here. So from line 1 to line 80, around about 80 lines of code, 100 lines of code, and I have only one dependency here, which is a tool scrape it, which helps me to understand the page. So once again, a fairly simple setup just to get me running on what is this. And if you compare this to the X package.json we saw earlier, this is the condensed thing, right? So I learned first about the condensed things because at the end of the day, think about the game of nodes. When you simply enter a new ecosystem, ecosystem with lots of libraries with years of experience building stuff outside of Visual Force pages. So don't be afraid. The world out there is huge, but it all fits together nicely. Debugging node projects in VS Code because you don't need to do a lot of things and you can easily breakpoint and debug your code as soon as you test it. Another thing that was important for me was async JavaScript, which is a challenge for the brain, so to say, because your code doesn't run line by line anymore as soon as you start applying async, and that's not async per se a topic, but since callback functions, this is the way how JavaScript thinks. So these loops and hoops are because there's the promises API, which handles promises, and promises are a great new concept in JavaScript. And I'm saying new because to me it was new. It might not be new in terms of years or months, but think back on the Aura and code that I'm writing, and I'm still writing Aura code professionally. For technical reasons and framework reasons, we don't use promises. We could, but we don't. So I had to learn about them as well new, and especially also that there's something like the promise nifty little functions like .all, which says, okay, give me all the things that you want to be resolved and worked at, and I will only return when I'm done with all of them. And with that, I could build my library that took those URLs and parsed them into a JSON data structure format, which then was used to display the quotation. And the displaying quotation was another app that I built quickly that tried to endeavor some other learning goals, namely, okay, how do I implement my own package? How do imports and exports work in JavaScript? I was determined to set up SLDS as a static resource this time, or as a fixed CSS file somewhere in my project structure. I also read about the fact that nobody writes HTML by hand anymore. So like we do in our components or LWC components, you use something called a templating engine. And I wanted to get a feel for what's this and how could it help me. I wanted to not touch Salesforce or LWC for this project at all. And I wanted to get a little bit more knowledge about tooling, which is in particular the no daemon tooling part of my setup. And no daemon is simply a tool that watches for my files changes, and if my files changes, it refreshes the browser or leads to refreshes. So it makes developing a blaze, because as a Salesforce developer, I'm used to, okay, do something on my machine and push it, or do it in a developer console and save it, but saving takes time nonetheless. Nothing or well, Visualforce pages used to auto refresh from developer console, but at least from VS Code, there's no auto refresh, and I'm hitting refresh all of the time on my record pages. So it's a complete different kind of feeling for me working in JavaScript. From here, we will hop back into code and have a look there in part of the UI. Once again, we will start with the package.json just to give you an idea. Okay, it got bigger. There have been some scripts added. Scripts are a part of the packaging engine, which help you combine certain bits and pieces to run if you want to, for example, restart the application or work out the application, meaning watching the application. And here's the no daemon that would tell the server, okay, please refresh because I've seen changes in the file system. We see a few dependencies. Most of them I haven't selected by hand. The most important ones are probably Express. The other ones that I personally added are the Salesforce release parser, which is the NPM package that I was just talking about. And the other one was unique random array, because one of the requirements was also that the quotation shouldn't show too often. So if I have 200 quotations, all 200 quotations need to be displayed before I see a single repetition. And it's all very, very, very close to the first app that I built, or had Rene Winkelmeyer wire up for me. So as soon as you start with JS, you have a few files and folders, with Express.js, you have a few files and folders that help you structure UI side of things like fonts, images, JavaScript, and style sheets. Style sheets is where I simply copied over SLDS. They're so-called rules, which means where are users actually ending up to, and there's not much logic here. I'm getting my random array entry. Remember the NPM package I built that basically serves a JSON as soon as my server starts up. The JSON is written, and then this JSON is my read-only database for the quotations. And then I use the random array NPM library in order to chunk that data down into congestible pieces. The interesting part for me was, as I said, actually working with SLDS in the templating engine. I really can't remember. I'm sorry for that. I'm really sorry for that. Why I use Jade, I probably read somewhere that it is one of the more frequently used templating engines. And as I said, I am used to writing HTML by hand. And this is how a lightning card looks in Jade. And not only that, the latter part down here is responsible for the refreshing. So every given set refresh interval, which is a setting for the server, then you will get a new quotation from the whole app. And obviously, if I point out the last thing for Heroku, there's always a proc file in that simply tells Heroku how to spin up the actual application. And even if you look at that, that's still a lot less dependencies than your regular DX project has. And this leads me
Sorry to stop you.
for today, which is that Oh, where's the screenshot? Here's no
Hey,
screenshot.
Kishan, sorry to stop you. Look like your
Okay.
screen is frozen couple of times. Look like a bandwidth issue.
Yeah, I'm seeing my internet connection. Okay. Let me see. Okay, looks good from my side. Is it okay for you again?
Yep. Yep. We can go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So look at this. So I give you the perfect example. We have like 7 lines of code of dependencies for my web app that reads the quotations JSON and displays them. And if we scroll up into regular DX projects files, you see we have just as many and a lot more scripts that are running. And each of these tools does an awesome thing, and you can read up on that. But what I'm saying is, once again, we are entering, or if you're going from into the JavaScript perspective of platform, you're entering a complete new platform. And I think it was on my, let me just see on this repo. So yeah, I make it a little better for you. So this is one of the nifty messages that I never get for Salesforce projects, which is some kind of GitHub feature now tells me there's some vulnerabilities in my app, and I checked them, and there's also npm audit fix, and I could only get rid of 3 vulnerabilities. And that's where I'm saying, okay, I lack the experience of really investigating those vulnerabilities, and given that we're not in a hobby project context like I am right now, I wouldn't be able to give my boss a certain estimate if there's an attack vector for me or there isn't. So in that, I'm saying there's still a lot out there to learn, especially in the terms of security, but I focus for the exam not on those security issues, but on language fundamentals and Node.js, and build 3 apps, which we talked about. And the last part of the presentation will be a very quick look at the super badge, which is a prerequisite for the passing certification. And if there are no questions, Amit, then we could start wrapping our session up.
Yep, I see some question into the chat window. So somebody asked, there is a specific order to do the super batch or the JavaScript question, JavaScript exam. So someone already answered. Like if you are good in JavaScript, go ahead with the multiple choice question first. If you are new, try super batch first, then go for the exam. So if you want to add on anything, please feel free to add on this question. And let me check some more question. So somebody say, I heard an estimate that exam was 95% code. Did you find this is to be true?
As I said, I did not the exam out there that is now. I did the beta exam, which was twice as many questions. But yes, I concur from remembering it mostly was code. So I mostly was reading, parsing, understanding code. Yes.
So there is another question where the vulnerability was coming from, JS code.
Can you repeat that, please?
Where the vulnerability was coming from? Then a question mark JS code.
Oh, okay. No, we can obviously have a look at the, I have no, so if you go deep down in the rabbit hole, you know that the package I reference have more package references. I have no clue what these 3 packages are. And I'm no in that regard, certain no JavaScript expert. So I'm not the person to talk to about those things. I would love to learn about those things. So if there's anyone in the audience who wants to do an Apex hour on how to fix vulnerabilities of packages you have no clue about, I'd love to have that.
That's a good topic. We can.
What I've heard is from my JavaScript buddies is basically ideally the package providers will fix those issues and release new versions to mitigate.
Guys, if you have any question, feel free to put it in the chat
Super
window.
badge. In terms of the super badge, there's one important addition to the answer to the questions we just had. The super badge can also be perceived as so imagine you are this 2-year experienced JavaScript developer. Then the super badge teaches you how to deploy and retrieve and work with Lightning APIs. If you don't have a lot of JS experience, it will be a hard ride because you will have to grasp the language fundamentals as well as all the new LWC specific stuff, especially around wire decorators and using specific Salesforce APIs. Since the super badge, at least when I did it, is, as all code super badges, very picky about the results you produce. The super badge takes time. I think in last time I had a look on them, it said 8 hours, but I think now it says around about 12 hours of work in order to get the super badge done. And that's only super badge. Per se, the other things you need to do is the quick start, the API that I mentioned, also a chapter on JS testing, and a badge on components that work for screen readers, for example. And at the end of the day, if you have had the pleasure of doing specialist super badge, then the use case will be familiar to you. That's basically what you will be building. That's the friendships app and once code, which I ago in June. And you build a fully fledged app with most awesome resources. Is right here where we are now. Apex Hours, they had at least this year 3 sessions, amazing sessions on JavaScript by another Salesforce developer evangelist, by people from developer groups, by another Salesforce MVP, and there's by now also decent content on Trailhead to prepare for the credentials, and also a trail. And with that, I'd open the board for questions and a little bit of discussion. My challenge currently is I finished the certification, but as